They thought I came to watch. I didn't correct them. When I walked into the auction house that Tuesday morning, my hair pulled back, wearing a plain gray blazer I'd bought 3 years ago. My cousin was the first one to see me. She nudged her mother, my aunt, and they both turned. The look on their faces wasn't surprise. It was amusement. "Oh my God," my cousin whispered, loud enough for the row behind her to hear. "She actually came." My aunt pressed her lips together the way she always did when she was trying not to laugh in public. She almost managed it. I found a seat near the back. I set my bag on the chair beside me. I didn't look at them again. The auction was for Hargrove Estate, 14 acres in Westchester County, a stone manor house built in 1908, 6 bedrooms, a carriage house, a pond, and a meadow that turned gold every October. It had belonged to my father's family for 2 generations. My grandfather built his furniture business in the carriage house. My grandmother planted the rose garden along the south wall. My father grew up running through those 14 acres like they were the whole world. He died when I was 9. My mother followed him 4 years later. A stroke, sudden, on a Wednesday afternoon in March. After that, the estate passed to my uncle, my father's older brother, because the will was old and my father had never updated it to account for me. I was 13 years old. My uncle and aunt moved into the manor house within the month. I moved into the small guest room at the end of the east hall, the one with the window that faced the carriage house instead of the garden. I was told I should be grateful. I told myself the same thing for years. They were not cruel people in the way that leaves marks you can show someone. They were cruel in the way that accumulates. Small dismissals, quiet reminders that the house was theirs, that my parents' savings had been absorbed into household expenses, that my college fund, which my mother had spent 8 years building, had been redirected. My aunt explained it to me when I was 16, sitting at the kitchen table, in a tone that suggested she was doing me a favor by being honest. "You weren't going to get into anywhere worth the money anyway," she said. "You're smart, but not that kind of smart." I didn't argue. I was 16. I had nowhere to go. But I listened, I watched, and I planned. I applied to 14 colleges my senior year without telling anyone. I applied for 11 scholarships. I got into 3 schools and won 4 scholarships. I chose the state university 2 hours away because the scholarship covered everything: tuition, housing, books, a small stipend for food. The morning I left, my uncle shook my hand at the door. My aunt reminded me to return the spare house key. My cousin, who was 12 and had grown up watching her parents treat me like a guest who'd overstayed, didn't come downstairs at all. I drove away in a 2003 Honda Civic I'd bought with 2 summers of waitressing money, and I did not look back. That was 11 years ago. A lot can happen in 11 years if you are disciplined about what you want. I majored in computer science and business. I graduated with honors. I took a job at a mid-sized logistics software company in Austin, Texas. Stayed 5 years, learned everything I could about how enterprise software was built and sold and scaled. Then I left and built my own. My company was called Clarence Systems. We built supply chain automation tools for mid-market manufacturers, the kind of companies that were too large for spreadsheets and too small for SAP. We were not glamorous. We did not get written up in tech magazines. But we were useful and we were profitable, and after 6 years of 18-hour days and a team I trusted more than anyone in my family had ever trusted me, we were acquired. The number was $31 million. After taxes and distributions to my co-founder and early employees, I kept $18.4 million. I was 31 years old. I did not call my uncle to tell him. I did not call my aunt. I did not post anything. I opened a private wealth management account with a firm in Manhattan, bought a 1-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn that cost less than people assumed, and went back to work consulting for the acquiring company while I figured out what came next. What came next turned out to be Hargrove Estate. I found out it was going to auction through a real estate newsletter I'd subscribed to years earlier, mostly out of habit. The listing stopped me mid-scroll. 14 acres, Westchester County. Stone Manor House, 1908. Carriage house, pond, south-facing rose garden. The asking estimate was $8.2 to $9.5 million. I sat with my phone in my hand for a long time. Then I called my attorney and told her I wanted to attend the auction and potentially bid up to $13 million. She asked if I'd had the property inspected. I told her I'd grown up there. She scheduled the inspection for the following week. The inspection confirmed what I already knew. The house needed work. The roof over the east wing had been neglected. The carriage house had water damage. The rose garden my grandmother planted had been mostly pulled out and replaced with gravel at some point in the last decade. That one hurt more than I expected. But the bones were good. The land was exceptional, and it was mine in every way that mattered except legally. I registered for the auction under my company's holding entity, a Delaware LLC called Crane Ridge Properties that my attorney had set up for real estate acquisitions. My name was not on any public-facing document. To anyone looking at the registration list, there was no reason to connect Crane Ridge Properties to the girl who had lived in the East Hall guest room. My aunt and uncle had no idea I was coming. I learned later from the auctioneer's assistant, who had no particular reason not to tell me, that my uncle had spent 3 months preparing for this auction. He had taken out a home equity line against a property he owned in Connecticut, liquidated a brokerage account, and arranged a short-term bridge loan secured against the estate itself, which he was selling. He had assembled, through significant effort and not a little risk, approximately $9.8 million in available funds. He intended to buy back the estate he was selling because he had run out of other options. The furniture business my grandfather built had contracted sharply over the past decade. The manor house was expensive to maintain. He had, in the quiet way of people who were never forced to be careful, spent more than he earned for 20 years. The estate was the last significant asset. If he could buy it at auction, he planned to convert the carriage house into a luxury rental and take out a second mortgage to fund his retirement. He had explained this plan to my cousin, who had relayed it to her husband, who had mentioned it to someone who eventually mentioned it to someone I knew from college. I knew all of this before I walked into the auction house. My cousin spotted me because I was not hiding. I had registered, I had my paddle, number 14, which I found privately appropriate, and I was sitting in the third row from the back, dressed plainly, giving no indication that I was anything other than a mildly curious observer. "She actually came," my cousin said. My aunt, recovering her composure, leaned slightly toward my uncle and murmured something. He turned, found me with his eyes, and his expression moved through surprise, then something that might have been relief. If I was here, I had no money. If I had no money, he had nothing to worry about. He gave me a small, magnanimous nod. The nod of a man who has already won. I looked down at my paddle and said nothing. The auction began at 10 o'clock. There were 6 registered bidders. Hargrove Estate was the third lot. The opening bid was set at $7 million. A bidder I didn't recognize, a developer, I guess from the way he dressed and the 2 men flanking him, opened at $7.2 million. Another bidder, a woman in her 60s who I later learned was a Greenwich interior designer looking for a personal property, countered at $7.5 million. My uncle entered at $7.8 million. The developer dropped out at $8.4 million. The designer stayed until $8.9 million, then set her paddle down with the deliberate calm of someone who had decided in advance what the number meant to her. At $9 million, it was my uncle and one other bidder, a quiet man near the front, whose paddle I could barely see from my seat. At $9.4 million, the quiet man bid for the last time. My uncle countered at $9.5 million without hesitating. The quiet man shook his head. The auctioneer began to close. $9.5 million, going once. I raised paddle number 14. $9.6 million, from the back. Do I have 9.7? My uncle turned around. The expression on his face. I have thought about it since, tried to be honest with myself about whether I felt satisfaction or something more complicated. What I felt was both. He was not a monster. He was a man who had made a series of selfish decisions over many years and had never once been asked to account for them. He was looking at me now, the way people look when they suddenly understand that the past is not as finished as they assumed. He bid $9.7 million. I bid $9.8 million. He bid $9.9 million. I bid $10 million. There was a pause. The room was quiet in the way rooms get when everyone present understands that something is actually happening. My aunt had her hand over her mouth. My cousin had stopped pretending to look at her phone. My uncle bid $10.1 million. His jaw was tight. He was, I understood, at the outer edge of what he could access. The bridge loan had terms. The HELOC had a ceiling. He was doing the math that people do when they've nearly run out. I let him wait. The auctioneer gave the standard pause, looked toward me, paddle in hand. I bid $10.5 million. My uncle stared at me. I watched him make the decision. The wrong one, driven by ego and disbelief. He bid $10.6 million. I bid $11 million. He did not raise his paddle again. Not because he'd calculated that $11 million was too high. Because he was watching me hold paddle number 14 with the same steadiness I'd had since the opening bid, and he was beginning to understand, fully and without comfort, that I had not come here to watch. $11 million, the auctioneer said. Going once. Going twice. The gavel came down. Sold to Crane Ridge Properties. I set the paddle in my lap. Behind me, I heard my aunt make a sound that wasn't quite a word. The formalities after an auction are administrative and, if you have a good attorney, relatively brief. My attorney was already at the registration table. I walked back to sign the initial paperwork, and it was there, in that narrow administrative hallway, that my uncle found me. He looked older than he had 20 minutes ago. That is not an exaggeration. I don't understand, he said. His voice was controlled, but only just. Where did you get? He stopped. Started again. Crane Ridge Properties, that's you? Yes, I said. How? I looked at him. He was genuinely asking, not as a negotiation, not as a challenge. He actually didn't know. In the 11 years since I'd driven away in that old Civic, he had apparently never once wondered what I was doing. I built a company, I said. I sold it. He was quiet for a moment. How much? Enough, I said. My aunt appeared at the end of the hallway. She took in the scene. Me at the table, attorney beside me, my uncle standing with his hands at his sides, and her face shifted through several things before settling into something I could only describe as recalibration. Surely, she said, and she said it carefully, we can talk about this. I looked up from the document I was reviewing. Talk about what? The estate. It's been in your father's family. In our family. She gestured slightly as though to include me in that word. There must be a way. I'm buying the estate, I said. That's the conversation. Your uncle has plans. The carriage house. I know about the carriage house, I said. I know about the bridge loan. I know what this auction was meant to accomplish. I set down the pen I was holding. I also know about my mother's insurance policy and my college fund. I've known for a long time. My aunt's expression did not collapse. She was too practiced for that. But something behind it shifted. That was a long time ago, she said. Yes, I said. It was. I signed the document. My attorney collected it. We thanked the auctioneer's office and walked out through the main hall. My cousin was waiting in the lobby near the entrance doors. She was 30 now. She'd been 12 when I left. I had not spoken to her in years, not out of anger exactly, more out of the recognition that we had been shaped by the same household into people who had very little to say to each other. She looked at me the way people look when they've spent years holding one version of a story and have just been handed a different one. I didn't know, she said. About the money, what they did. I know, I said, because I believed her. She'd been 12. What happens now? She asked. To them? I thought about this. I had thought about it for a long time, actually, since the day I first saw the auction listing and understood that I could do something about it. They'll be fine, I said. They still have the Connecticut property. The HELOC will need to be resolved, but there's equity. It's not nothing. I paused. They'll have to be careful for a while. They've never had to be careful. That will be hard for them. My cousin nodded slowly. I'm not doing this to hurt them, I said, and I meant it. I'm doing it because it's mine. It was always mine. She didn't argue with that. I hired a contractor the following month. The east wing roof was repaired first. The carriage house took longer. Water damage goes deep if it's been ignored long enough, and it had been ignored for years. I moved into the manor house in the spring, into the bedroom that had been my parents', the one with the window that overlooked the south garden. The rose garden took the most time. I found my grandmother's old planting records in a box in the carriage house, a spiral notebook with her handwriting, lists of varieties, sketches of where each plant had gone. I hired a garden designer who specialized in historic restoration. We ordered from 3 different heritage rose nurseries. We started from the sketches and planted everything where it had been. The first summer, most of it was still establishing. Small plants, not much to see. But along the stone wall where the original garden had been densest, one climber came back stronger than expected. A pale yellow rose that must have been left in the ground when everything else was pulled out, dormant for years, waiting. On the morning I found it blooming, I stood at the edge of the garden for a long time. My grandmother had grown up with nothing. She had married a man who built a furniture business in a carriage house in Westchester and made it into something real. She had planted that garden herself, cane by cane, and tended it until she couldn't. She would have been practical about all of this. She would not have needed it to be poetic. But I think she would have been glad, in her practical way, that someone came back for the roses. I run my consulting work from the study on the ground floor now, the one with east-facing windows and bookshelves along 3 walls that I filled slowly, one box at a time. My team is distributed, most of them in Austin still, a few in New York, one in Denver. We work well over video. When I need to think, I walk the 14 acres. My uncle called once, about 4 months after the auction. He wanted to know if I had any interest in discussing a long-term lease arrangement for the carriage house. I told him I didn't. He thanked me for taking his call. It was the most considerate exchange we'd ever had. I haven't heard from my aunt. My cousin texted me last fall, a photo of the rose garden she'd seen on a real estate site that had done a small feature on historic property restorations in Westchester. She'd recognized the stone wall. The message just said, "It looks beautiful." I wrote back, "It took a while, but it came back." She sent a heart. I sent one back. It was more than we'd managed in 20 years, and it was enough. I am not a person who needs the last word. I never have been. What I needed was the land, the carriage house, the room with the right window, the garden my grandmother left behind. What I needed was to come back and do the thing no one thought I could. They laughed when I walked in. I understand why. I looked exactly like what they thought I was. The girl from the East Hall, unremarkable in a 3-year-old blazer. No reason to take seriously. The mistake was thinking that what you see is all there is. I raised paddle number 14 and I bought the house I was raised in, and I planted back the roses. And I go to sleep every night in the room where my parents used to sleep, and I wake up to 14 acres that belong at last to someone who will not let them go. They thought they knew me. They didn't know me at all. There is a version of this story where I stay angry, where I walk into that auction house with something to prove, something hot and urgent driving every bid. I used to think that was the version I wanted, but when I actually raised paddle number 14, what I felt wasn't rage. It was something quieter. The particular calm of a person who did the work and is now simply collecting what the work produced. That's the thing no one tells you about building a life from nothing. The discipline required isn't dramatic. It doesn't look like anything from the outside. It looks like a girl in a gray blazer sitting in the back row, and it looks like that for 11 years before anyone understands what they're actually looking at. My uncle and aunt made their choices early and lived comfortably inside them for a long time. They spent money that wasn't theirs. They told a grieving teenager she wasn't smart enough for college because it was easier than accounting for what they'd taken. They let decades pass without once considering that the girl in the East Hall guest room was paying attention, remembering, and building something in the silence they assumed was defeat. That is the nature of consequence. It does not announce itself. It accumulates the same way discipline does, quietly, consistently, over time, and then one Tuesday morning it walks into an auction house in a 3-year-old blazer and raises a paddle. I want to be clear about something. I didn't win because I was lucky. I won because I made a decision at 16, sitting at that kitchen table, listening to my aunt explain why my future wasn't worth investing in. I made a decision that her version of me was not the version I was going to live. That decision cost me years of early mornings and late nights, and a level of focus that left very little room for anything else. It was not glamorous. It was not a shortcut. It was the daily, unglamorous choice to become someone my circumstances said I couldn't be. Intelligence without integrity eventually collapses under its own contradictions. My uncle was not a stupid man. He was a man who never had to be honest about what he was doing, and so he never developed the discipline that honesty demands. He built his retirement plan on an asset he'd neglected, secured by loans he couldn't easily service, against a house he was already selling. That is what happens when cleverness substitutes for character over a long enough period of time. Resilience is not about refusing to be hurt. It's about refusing to let being hurt become your ending. I was hurt. I was a 13-year-old girl who lost both her parents and then lost what remained of her safety net to people who should have protected it. That hurt was real. But I chose, year by year, to make it fuel instead of a ceiling. Maya came back for the roses. She came back for the carriage house, the pond, the 14 acres, the room with the right window. She came back not to punish, but to reclaim. Because some things belong to you, not because of a legal document, but because of everything you carry and everything you survived to get there. Whatever your version of the estate is, whatever was taken from you, dismissed, or underestimated, the work of getting it back starts the same way every time. Quietly, consistently, with more patience than anyone expects you to have. They didn't know who I was. I had spent 11 years making sure I did.